Hello YouTube and welcome to another Cisco tutorial. So in this video I'm gonna show you how to protect your Cisco devices against ARP poisoning or ARP spoofing. So are you ready? Let's get started. So first thing first, what is ARP? So actually ARP stands for Address Resolution Protocol, okay? So it's a communication protocol used for discovering the MAC address associated with the given IPv4 address. Simply as that, okay? So I will show you that in this lab. So for example, here in my lab we have actually a couple of devices. We have a Cisco router, so as you can see here at the bottom, that acts as an DHCP server, okay? We have also Cisco switch, okay? And we have two DHCP clients. So on the right we have our legitimate DHCP client, okay? It's just a Linux distribution, okay? And on the other side we have a Kali Linux, which is also a DHCP client, but it will play a role of an attacker, okay? So as I told you, let's go to the DHCP server and see actually the configuration. So I will go to my DHCP server here. So it's a router. Let me show you just the configuration for the DHCP server. So as you can see here, we have a pool called clients. We set up network, okay? We set up a default gateway, and we set up also DHCP server, okay? So in order to see all the IP addresses that has been allocated, we issue the command show IP DHCP binding, okay? Here we go. So you can see here that the DHCP server has actually allocated two IP addresses, and here in this table we can see them. So the first one, that 1.3, is actually allocated to our Linux box here on the right, so as you can see here, and the other one, that 1.4, is actually allocated to our Kali Linux, okay? So if we move on to our Linux box here on the right, we can issue the command ifconfig in order to confirm that. So as you can see here, this Linux box has indeed get the IP address that 1.3, okay, and it has MAC address that ends with AF0000, as you can see here, okay? And this is the same output that we get actually in our router, okay? So let's go actually to the Kali Linux and verify also it get this that 1.4 IP address. Here we go. So we go to our Kali Linux on the terminal. I will just issue the command ifconfig, and I will do more because it has many network cards, and I want just to see the first one, which is Ethernet 0, and indeed it got that 1.4 IP address, and as you can see it has MAC address that ends with 2C 0000, okay? So we are done here, okay? So now I will try to issue an ARP poisoning attack on this network using this Kali Linux box. But here once again, disclaimer, just for educational purposes, don't do that on any other networks, okay, without write-it actually authorization, okay? So you do it just for lab or for educational purposes, okay? So I will use, as I told you, this attacker in order to perform what we call ARP poisoning. So first of all, what is ARP poisoning or ARP spoofing? So in the ARP spoofing attack, actually the attacker, which is here this Kali Linux, will send ARP messages on the LAN in order to associate its own MAC address with the IP address of another host, and generally this other host will be actually the default gateway, which is in our case this router here. So any packets sent to default gateway actually will pass through this Kali Linux. Okay, so here the Kali Linux will play the role of the man in the middle. So actually here we will be performing man in the middle attack using this technique. Okay, so first thing first, let's go to this Kali Linux box and see what we can do. So if I open our Kali Linux here, first of all, let me configure this Kali Linux in order to forward packets, so before actually performing the attack. So in order to do that, it's pretty simple. We have actually to change a parameter here in the Kali Linux from 0 to 1. So if we do a cat on this system file here, and here remember you should be root in order to do that. So if I open this file here, process net IPv4 IP forward, so you can see the output here is 0, so we have to change it to 1 in order to allow this Linux box Kali Linux to forward packets. So I will just issue the command here, echo 1 to the file. Here we go. So now let's verify. So now we have 1 instead of 0. So now our Kali Linux is capable of forwarding packets. So we are done here. So now we'll be using a tool, very famous one called ettercap for sniffing actually packets. Okay, but before to do that, before to perform the attack, let me show you the ARP cache on every station on my network. Okay, so actually ARP cache is just a ARP table that shows the mapping between MAC addresses and IP addresses. So if I go for example to this Linux box and I do ARP in order to see the ARP cache, I will get nothing, simply because there is no traffic. So let me ping some host, for example the default gateway, in order to generate some traffic. Here we go, I can ping my default gateway. Let's ping also the other DSCP client, which is Kali Linux, just to generate some traffic. Okay, so now let's execute ARP to see the ARP cache of this Linux box. Okay, here we go. So I get actually the ARP table, which is a mapping between IP addresses and MAC addresses. So here you can see the IP address of this Kali Linux with its actually MAC address, and we got the same for the default gateway, which is IP address associated with its MAC address. We can see also that on this router. So we go to our router and we issue the command show ARP, and we'll get actually also the same result. So here we have that 1.3, which is the IP address of the Linux box, and with its own MAC address. We get also that 1.4, which is the IP address of the Kali Linux with its MAC address. Okay, so as I told you, ARP poisoning will actually change the MAC address of the router with the MAC address of the attacker, which is in our case Kali Linux. So let's perform this attack. So I will return back to my Kali Linux. Here we go. So I will go here to this menu, and there is actually some sniffing and spoofing tool, and inside it we can find the ether cap. So let's click on it. Here we go. So this is our tool. It's a very simple tool that we'll be using actually. So its primary interface is Ethernet 0, so this is okay for me, so I'm gonna validate that. Here we go. So you see here at the bottom the output. So starting unified sniffing. So the first thing that we have to do is to scan the network for the hosts. So I will click on this icon here, scan for hosts. Here we go. It will scan the whole network for the hosts, and here as you can see it has detected 3 hosts. So if I return back to my topology, we have 3 hosts. We have our router, switch, and Linux client. Okay, so let's return back to Kali Linux. We can actually see them by clicking on this icon here, host lists. Here we go. So the first one, that 1.2, is actually the IP address of the switch. The second one, that 1.3, is the IP address of the Linux on the right. And at the bottom we have that 254, which is the IP address of actually default gateway. So in order to perform the ARP sniffing, or ARP spoofing actually, or some call it ARP poisoning, we're gonna select our targets. So I'm gonna select the Linux box here, and I will add it to target 1. So here we go. You can see here on the log, host has been added to target 1. Okay, and I will click to the default gateway and I will add it to target 2. Here we go. So now we have chosen our targets. So now let's perform the actual attack, the man in the middle attack. So I will click on this globe here icon, and you can see this is the man in the middle menu, and we have here different options. So we'll choose ARP poisoning or ARP spoofing. Here we go, and by default it's sniff remote connection. So I will launch the attack using OK. So now the attack has been launched. So let's verify that. So as I told you, in this attack, these IP addresses, or actually these MAC addresses, will be replaced by the MAC address of the attacker. So any traffic going to, for example, the DHCP, which is the default gateway, will go through this Kali Linux. So let's verify that. So let's open our Linux. So before, as you can see here, this is the ARP cache. So now let's see the new ARP cache after the attack has been launched. Okay, so as you can see here, it will show us the mapping between IP addresses and MAC addresses. So the most interesting thing here to spot is the MAC address of the default gateway, which is in this case that 254. So before it was ending with E0 and 4 zeros, but now it has changed to 2C4 zeros. Okay, so actually with this attack we changed the MAC address of the default gateway to the MAC address of the Kali Linux. Okay, so on this host here Linux, we actually successfully changed its ARP cache. So any packets going to this default gateway will go actually to the Linux box or the Kali Linux, which is now acts as a man in the middle. So let's verify the same thing on this router here. So this is the ARP cache before the attack. So now let's see it after the attack, and as you can see, the same thing happened here for the Linux box on the right. So before it was its legitimate MAC address, which is 81AF, but now it has changed to the MAC address of the attacker, which is 74 to C, as you can see here. Okay, so now this Kali Linux box acts as man in the middle. So for example, let me open Kali Linux, and I will go here to this menu to view the connections. Here we go. So if I try from this Linux box to access, for example, this router using telnet, here we go. So I will type telnet. So here I'm on my Linux box, and I'll try to telnet to the router. Here we go. So we have here a password to enter. So you can see here on my Kali Linux that I have actually show me the connections. Okay, so if I return back to here to my Linux, and if I enter the password, so now I am inside this DHCP server, which is Cisco router. And if I return back to the Kali Linux, you can see here that I have this connection detail. So if I double click on it, you can see that I get actually the password that I have entered in clear text, because as you know, telnet send passwords in clear text. So with this simple tool, we got actually the password. On the right side, it shows me actually the receiving hosts, which is in this case Cisco router, and on the left side it shows me the sending packets. And with this simple tool, we can actually view the password that is in clear text. Of course, we can also use Wireshark in order to capture traffic, but with this tool, you can see it's pretty easy to get actually the result. So we have successfully done actually a man in the middle attack. Okay, so let me just close that. So I will terminate here, stop the man in the middle attack, and I will stop also sniffing. So how can we actually stop that from happening to our network? So actually the configuration will rely here on the switch. We'll configure DHCP snooping on this Cisco switch and ARP inspection. So why we are using the DHCP snooping? Because ARP inspection will rely actually on the DHCP server to get the legitimate mapping between IP addresses and MAC addresses. Okay, so in order to configure DHCP snooping on this Cisco router, on this Cisco switch, it's pretty easy, as you have seen on my previous videos. So I will go to my switch here, and I will go to global config mode. So in order to configure, first of all, the DHCP snooping, we have to do two commands. The first one is we have to configure the DHCP snooping globally. Okay, and also we have to do it per VLAN. So I will enter here VLAN 1. Okay, and another thing, we have to configure this interface with Giga Ethernet 0/2 as a trusted interface. So these are all the commands. So here I will enter the Giga interface 0/2, and I will configure it as trusted interface. Trust. Here we go. We can view the whole configuration using the command show IP DHCP snooping. So here you can see that DHCP snooping is enabled on VLAN 1, and you can see that we have configured the interface 0/0 as a trusted interface. So this is the first step in order to avoid this ARP poisoning attack. So first of all, we have to configure the switch as DHCP snooping with this interface here, 0/0 as a trusted interface. as trusted interface. And now we can configure ARP inspection. So same thing here, ARP inspection is enabled per VLAN. So I will enter here the command ARP inspection VLAN 1. Okay, and we'll go also to the same interface and we configure it as a trusted interface. So interface giga 2/0 or 0/2 EP ARP inspection trust. Here we go. So those are the commands necessary in order to configure ARP inspection. So we can view that with the command show IP ARP inspection. Okay, so you can see here that the ARP configuration inspection is configured on VLAN 1. Okay, so this is the most interesting thing here to note. Okay, so with these two simple commands we can avoid to get actually some ARP poisoning or ARP spoofing in our network. Okay, so that was just a brief introduction to the ARP poisoning or ARP spoofing attacks. As always, I hope it has been informative for you, and I want to thank you for viewing. Bye bye.